All right, so today we are going to talk about some of the other weird things that can happen with genetics. So as we know, we have dominant and recessive genes, and those genes can be inherited in different patterns like complete dominance, incomplete dominance, or codominance. But there's other things that can affect our genes because we are not just solely a product of our genes, but also a product of our environment. So this first example we're going to talk about here shows about how the environment can influence the expression of our genes. So the genes are still there, it's just kind of whether they're turned on or off. So the ability for one single gene to affect an organism in several ways, depending on what's going on in the environment, has to do with this expression. So the example I like to do is Siamese cats. So you see this little Siamese cat down here. I had a good friend of mine who had Siamese cats, and they were her favorite cat. And when we looked at these cats, typically they had a really dark face and dark ears and dark little paws and dark on their tail. Well, when I met my friend, she was living in New York, which is where I'm originally from. And so her cat was very dark on the face and the ears. And the reason why that is because they're adapting to a cold environment, and that dark fur actually helps keep them warmer because it attracts the sunlight. So you can kind of visualize it this way, like I have my little kitty. I'm going to try to draw this. This is going to get real bad. Here's my kitty, all right, with dark ears. A very dark face, so we're gonna do this and make it kind of dark in here. They have lots of stripes. All right, he's got a little body. Here's his little tail. Whoop, wow, that's a weird tail. All right, his tail's gonna be dark. He's got dark legs. All right, everything's very, very dark. All right, because this guy is a cold environment, so it's kind of like if you took a kitten and you raised it in the freezer. All right, this is what he would look like. Don't freeze kittens, it's a bad idea. So they'd be very, very dark in color. And so the cold temperatures basically turn on these genes for producing all this pigment. Well, my friend who loved these Siamese cats actually ended up moving to Florida. In the process, while they moved, her female, she was breeding her, and she was pregnant. And so her babies, when they were born, they were still Siamese cats, but they grew up in Florida where it's really hot. And so they still had some of the Siamese cat type coloration, but instead of having quite so much darkness to them, they had just little bits of kind of a lighter color on here. So just the very tip of the ears, the very tip of the tail, the very tip of the feet, and just a little bit, a tiny little bit on the face, okay? So these guys, not nearly as dark, even though genetically very similar to the mother. So in hot weather, they tend to have a lighter coat because they don't want to absorb as much of the sun's energy, and in cold weather, they're darker. And so there's a famous experiment with bunnies, these little bunnies, these black and white ones, where they strapped ice packs to their sides to turn on the genes that produce a pigment. And they did them actually in all different shapes, but I couldn't find a good picture of that. You know those fun little ice packs they put in your lunches? They're like star-shaped or moon-shaped. So they strapped them to the side of these little bunnies. They switched them out all the time to make sure that areas stay cold. And what happened is it turned on the genes under that fur, and that fur turned dark. And so that showed exactly how the environment could totally influence your genes. And so just to show you, I had my friend send me a little picture of her kitties. So here's her kitties. This is her female cat who was raised in New York. And you can see how dark she is because she was an inside-outside cat. And this is her little kitty being which is the baby of the big one, that is being raised in Florida. And this little kitty is much, much lighter. Then we got this polygenic inheritance. Poly means many, genic for genes. So these are traits that are controlled by many genes, 2 or more genes. And eye color is a great example, and I talked about eye color before in class. But this shows how really complex it can be, that here we have this dihybrid cross just for eye color, so for one trait, but it's controlled by more than one gene. And so when you have individuals with hazel eyes reproducing, you can have all different colored eyes in there, all the way from light blue to almost black when they get all those dominant genes that create a lot of pigment. And so blue is more recessive when you're not going to make a lot of pigment. And then you can have everything in between, from a darker blue to a lighter brown, and a huge amount of variety in there. And so usually what we call green eyes to begin with are not necessarily green, but there's one of these hazels in the middle here. And when we look at our eyes, there's really more than just 3 colors. There's all kinds of colors, and there's colors mixed in with your eyes as well. Like mine personally are blue, but there's a little bit of green right around the pupil. So we have other colors mixed in there that contribute to our eye color. So polygenic traits, traits controlled by many genes, tend to have the most variety in our population. So hair color is another one. There's no such thing as just blondes, brunettes, and redheads. There's every hair color in between out there, and that's because it is polygenic. Same with things like heights. There's no such thing as just tall and short, but everything in between, because height in humans is also polygenic. Skin color is another example of a polygenic trait, a trait that we see a lot of variety in the human population. So when you look at skin color, what we have here is 6 different alleles that determine our skin color. And so if it is a dominant allele, it's dominant for producing more melanin, or the pigment in our skin, and recessive produces less. So a famous example of this is this family over here. So this family over here, this gentleman, I believe he was of Hispanic descent, and mom was mixed race. So both of them were somewhere in here where they were kind of that nice tan even skin tone, because they had 3 dominant alleles and 3 recessive. So they produced these little girls, these cute little girls. These are twins, believe it or not. They are twins from the same 2 parents, and yet their skin tone is vastly different. So how might that happen? Well, twin number 1 over here has actually a darker skin tone than both her parents, so she's close to dad. She must have inherited more of these dark alleles from her parents, and so she could have got 2 from dad and 2 from mom, or 3 from dad and 1 from mom, any combination of those. Whereas her sister has very, very light skin. She probably falls somewhere in here. So she happened to inherit more of these light alleles. All right, so most of us, depending on your skin tone, fall somewhere in this range. This is the normal bell curve of skin tone. And then some of us might fall here on the edges, where you're very, very extremely light or very, very extremely dark skin tone. And that just means that you have all the alleles of one kind or another. So people who have this in-between nice tan Beyonce type skin tone, they could actually have children that have darker skin or lighter skin than them, just like these 2 little girls. So because skin is polygenic, you get a huge variety. And that's why when people go on like the Maury Povich show and they say, that's not my baby, it looks nothing like me. Well, it doesn't have to, especially with these polygenic traits, because you can get all kinds of variety out of parents that are basically heterozygous for the traits. Then we got what's called sex-linked genes. Sex-linked genes occur on your sex chromosomes. So we've learned that before, that if you are a girl, you have 2 X chromosomes. So I'm going to make a girl up here. These are your sex chromosomes. And if you're a boy, you have an X chromosome and a tiny, tiny little Y chromosome. And that tiny, tiny little Y chromosome has so very few genes on it, genes for testosterone and hairy ears, but not much of anything else. So when we look at sex-linked traits, they tend to show up more in men than they do in women. Because when you're talking about a woman, if you have two big X's, you could have, and I'll do color blindness, and color blindness is recessive, so we'll do a little b for color blindness, and big B is normal. So if you have two big B's, you can see color. If you have a big B and instead a little b, you can see it. And you would have to inherit two little b's on your sex chromosomes to be colorblind as a female, which means dad would have to be colorblind and mom would have to be a carrier, okay? Now for boys, it's different because that Y is there like it doesn't even exist. So it's like, meh, not there. So for you to be color vision, you have to inherit a big B, and to be colorblind, you would have to only get one little b, which means mom could be colorblind or mom could be a carrier. Either way would work. So these traits show up a lot more in males than they do in females, though there are obviously still some females who are colorblind. All right, and it's all because that Y chromosome is still teeny tiny, doesn't have the genes on there. So if we did, for example, a female who was colorblind. So let's say I had a female student who was colorblind. So she's going to have two X chromosomes because she's a female, and on there, two little b genes, right? So in order for her to be colorblind, like I said earlier, dad would have to be colorblind because he had to give her an X because he couldn't give her a Y, she'd be a boy. All right, the other little b had to come from mom. Now, we're not sure necessarily what mom has here. She could have a big B and be color vision, or she could be colorblind herself as well. If they had more kids, let's say mom was a carrier, so she has a big B over here, and they had more kids, this daughter would have color vision because she'd get a big B from mom, even though she's a carrier for color blindness and got a little b from dad. All right, then the boy, he would definitely have it because he get a little b from mom. And this boy would not have it. So in this case, it would be 50-50 no matter what because dad's colorblind. That's a big B. Ooh, kind of ugly. All right, now if dad was color vision, it would change everything. If dad was a big B, now she would be a big B and be color vision. This would be homozygous, two big Bs. This little boy still colorblind from mom. All right, and that's why boys have a better chance of getting it because they only need one of those alleles. So down here in the bottom corner, if you can't see some of these colors down here, if you can't read the numbers, you might be colorblind. So what you should see is a 29 in here, a 12 in here, a 15 in here, and a 42 in there. And the most common form of color blindness is red-green, when you can't tell the difference between these ones, and that's a 29 there. So if you have problems with that, you just might be colorblind, and then you got to ask your parents, hey, are any of you colorblind? Do you have any relatives who are colorblind? So here's another colorblind test. So this is the regular Roy G. Biv of the rainbow. If you are colorblind, this is going to look like one of these three, depending on what kind of color blindness you have, because there are other ones, and these are the names of them down here. All right, what kind of color blindness you have. So if any of these look the same, exactly the same, these two are similar to those of us who are color vision, then you might be colorblind. And this is what people with color blindness see. The most common, again, is you can't differentiate between the reds and the greens, so they all end up looking shades of green. All right, and some of them, they can't tell the purples from the blues either. And those are the most common. All right, so cool little test. If you know anybody who's colorblind, you can see what they think. Our genes can also be influenced by our sex, if we're male or female. And a good example of that is male pattern baldness. All right, you walk around society, you see a lot of bald men, but not so many bald women. So there's something genetically going on that's occurring. And what's going on is our hormones, all right? Our hormones influence these genes. So if you are a male and you have baldness on your mom's side of the family, then you are most likely going to have some kind of baldness as an adult, and that's because of your testosterone. However, your sisters, even if they have the same exact genes, even if you're identical twins, which it wouldn't be your sister, but even if you're twins and you have very similar genes, not going to be bald because the estrogen helps you to retain your hair. And so if you have male pattern baldness, you can go and take things like Rogaine, and if you look closely at those products, they have hormones in them to mimic female hormones and help you retain your hair. Right now we got a pedigree, not the dog food, but a pedigree is when you look at traits throughout a family. So if you have a purebred dog or horse or something like that, many of them come with a pedigree, and that tells you who their parents were, who their grandparents were, and so on. When we look at pedigrees as geneticists, we're looking at traits that are being passed down. And so some things we need to know about pedigrees is that a square is a male and a circle is a female. The ones that are colored in are the ones that are affected with whatever the trait is, and usually we're talking about disorders if we're doing this, though it could be something as simple as freckles. If there is a line across, that means they mated. All right, and if there's a line down, these are their children from that mating. All right, it has to be directly connected to them. If there's a kid over here, this is not their child. This is their son-in-law because he's mating with their daughter. Okay, so we're going to look at a pedigree here. So here's a very simple pedigree, and you'll notice that they label the generations with Roman numerals. And so if I was trying to tell you about an individual, I would say individual 2-3, and that would give me this person right here, and I would say they have the disorder. In this case, the disorder must be dominant because all these guys with the dominant letters are the ones who have the disorder, which means all the ones that aren't filled in all have to be homozygous recessive to not have it. So here is a pedigree of the current royal family. If we look at this, let me do purple. Right here, this is the current Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth. All right, that was her husband Philip. Down here is their children, and over here is the current princes, Prince William and Prince Harry, who they're also married with children now, but we didn't go down that far. All right, so if we look at this family, this real pedigree, one of the things that occurred in this royal family is hemophilia. Hemophilia is a sex-linked trait, so it shows up more in boys. Okay, that's what we talked about earlier with color blindness. And it's a trait where when they get cut, they don't stop bleeding. In current medical times, if you have hemophilia, you can go to the hospital and they will give you platelets, and that will help clot your blood so you have a much better chance of surviving. But in the long time ago, they didn't have those kind of resources. So the mutation began right here, right, with Queen Victoria. So there's original Victoria, she married Edward, and they had one daughter, Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria was heterozygous, because remember she has two X's, so she had one dominant allele and one recessive. She married Albert, which was normal, and everything was fine, and they had a whole bunch of kids. They had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 kids, which makes sense because back then the woman's job was purely to produce heirs, right? All right, so they had all these kids, and what we're seeing is this would be the oldest kid down to the youngest. And when we're looking at this, we see some of them came out fine. They inherited the recessive genes from both parents. This one was a carrier, so she did not have hemophilia, but she carried the gene. These boys happened to get the good gene from mom. They were fine. She was fine. He was fine. And then poor Leopold. Poor Leopold got the gene and had hemophilia, right? She was a carrier and she was fine. Now, most of the time, if you look at these boys, most of them that are colored in, their line does not continue, right? So think about being a royal and learning how to use swords and stuff in a time where you didn't have good medical care, and you had hemophilia. So a lot of them died, right? Then we got Leopold up here, who managed to live for a while. And that's because Leopold was way far down in succession, so he was actually like an academic. He liked to learn stuff, so he was like messing around with books. The only thing he had to worry about was a paper cut. So Leopold survived. He passed on those genes to one of his daughters. This is his son-in-law. And his two sons got lucky because they got the good genes from mom, and they only got a Y chromosome from dad, so they were fine. But if we look at like Beatrice over here, she gave her sons hemophilia. All right, it had to come from mom. And then their daughter was a carrier, so some of her sons had it as well. And then if we look over on this side, oh, well, what's going on over here, royal family? Well, these were cousins who got married, which is never a good idea, right? That's a little inbreeding. Their parents had different parents, like their moms were sisters. So they were cousins, first cousins. And so when you look at their kids, 2 out of 3, hemophilia, steady, right? So that's what we see with these sex-linked traits as we go through the population. Now, if we look at the current queen, there's no hemophilia down here, but was she related to the guy she married, to Philip? Well, yeah, she was, but way, way, way far back in time. It goes all the way back to Victoria and Albert. So they were like something like third cousins. So they were not closely related where it was going to be a big deal, but it was quite common for royal families to have some inbreeding back in the day. A little creepy. Luckily, they're not inbreeding anymore, so they have branched out. That's a good thing why Meghan Markle married Harry, get some new genes in that family. So we have a lot of disorders that can be inherited in a variety of ways, and so I just wanted to briefly go over some of those with you. The only dominant one, and the reason why it's the only dominant one is because most dominant disorders, the people die before they have a family. And Huntington's is different because Huntington's does not show up until you're in your 30s or 40s. So you think you're perfectly fine, and then bam, it gets you. But most people, by the time they're in their 30s or 40s, have already had a family. And so you could have big H, and have Huntington's, or big H, little h. And so, for example, let's say you're just a carrier for Huntington's, right? And you don't know it, and you get married, and let's say your wife or husband is normal, so they're recessive, and you go to have kids. This is the best case scenario with Huntington's. The best case scenario is that your kids have a 50, that's a lowercase h, oh my gosh, have a 50-50 chance of having Huntington's. That's the best you can do. If you're homozygous dominant, 100% of your kids are going to have Huntington's. You pass that on. And so with Huntington's, what happens is you start off normal, and then it kind of switches on in your 30s and 40s, and you start to lose the ability to move your muscles. Eventually you can't work, or you can't walk, and then it eats your brain, it eats your nerves, and so your brain goes from a normal brain to looking like this, and then eventually you die. So you die earlier when you have Huntington's disease. So most of them are recessive, so that you don't know you have it, you don't know you're going to pass it on, and that's how it ends. This is the only dominant one. So all these other ones that we're going to talk about are all recessive, which means you have to have 2 little alleles for them. So PKU, we talked about before. We said all babies are tested for this one at birth. If you were born in the hospital, it's recessive, and that's the one where you don't have an enzyme to break down a certain food, and so it builds. So a baby is missing something, and so it builds up, becomes toxic, and it destroys the brain, and you become more and more mentally handicapped. Cystic fibrosis is another recessive one, and this one, if you have this mutation that is passed on, it makes your lungs coated in this thick mucus, so you can see lungs x-ray of somebody with cystic fibrosis versus somebody who's normal. This mucus builds up in there, and so basically you're choking on your own mucus, and you have to take medications to thin the mucus, and then they put you in this vest that shakes you so you can cough the mucus up every day, just so you can breathe. Sickle cell, we talked before, this occurred originally as a point mutation, but it can be passed on genetically through families, and this is the one that makes your blood sickle shape right there. and is very, very painful for people. Tay-Sachs we also talked about. This is a frame shift mutation that can be passed on, and it breaks down your nervous system because you're lacking some of the genes to help insulate your nerve cells, and so you tend to die 2 to 4 years old. Hemophilia that we just looked at with the royal family is sex-linked, so it shows up more in boys, and that's when their blood does not clot. Color blindness we also just talked about is also sex-linked recessive, and you can't tell the difference between colors. So about 8% of males are colorblind, and it's closer to 1% for girls. All right, and the last one that we didn't talk about is muscular dystrophy. Muscular dystrophy is another sex-linked one, so it shows up more in boys. And this is when your muscle fibers break down over time and tends to shorten your lifespan. So this is one that runs in my family. I had an uncle who had muscular dystrophy, and I have an aunt who has it as well. So when we went to go have our son, we went and saw a geneticist, even though I kind of knew already, but just to make sure that we wouldn't be passing that on to our child. And here's just one more little graphic of a pedigree of the royal family, just to show you how weird these guys were. The reason why they interbred so much was to keep the power and the money in the family, and they just really didn't understand the consequences. But if you look into any of these guys, inbreeding is really bad, folks, really bad. So don't inbreed. Bye.